So, when should you monetize your podcast? When should you start or try starting to make money on your podcast? That's a question that I get asked all the time. And if I'm being totally honest with you, it still takes me by surprise. That's like somebody asking you when you should have a kid. It's really hard to answer. But I think, like deciding when you want to have a child, there are two ultimate factors that should play into your answer. And it's when you want to and when you actually can. In this episode, we're going to talk about the bare minimum of what you need to monetize a podcast, the monetization options for beginners, intermediate, and established podcasters, and finally, the pros and cons of monetization and the big mistake podcasters make when they fly too close to the monetization sun. Hello and welcome to Podcast for Profit. My name is Morgan Franklin. I'm a podcast producer, strategist, and educator. This podcast will help you create and grow a podcast that cuts through the noise of social media and speaks directly to your target audience. If you're ready to create a podcast that will align you with the experts in your industry, position yourself as a trusted leader, and create another source of revenue for your business, you're in the right place. To be honest with you, I've debated on whether or not I want to tell this story because it's always hard for me to judge another podcaster, especially a podcaster that I looked up to for so long. Okay, so the year is 2017. I'm 24 years old. I'm putting every single bit of money and time and effort I have into working for myself and trying to operate a small business for the first time. There is a new podcaster who I love listening to. We have a very similar story of working corporate and studying marketing and working for ourselves. I love her podcast. I never miss an episode. And at this time, it's really everything to me. It's helped me navigate so many different parts of my business and my life that I've just never experienced before. So, of course, when she starts to launch a course, I am right there. I'm on the webinar. I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to be able to afford this $1,200 course, which at the time was not conceivable. I ended up going on a payment plan and paying off this course over an entire year. I know we're kind of going down a rabbit hole here, but just come with me for a second. So the course ended up being pretty mediocre. It did teach me a few things, and, more than anything, I think it held me accountable to keeping going in my business. It delivered, but not exactly the way it said that it would. As time went on, and this creator started to add on more courses and digital products and books and sponsorships and affiliate codes and blah, 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 I started listening less and less. And then I started seeing more and more one-star reviews on this person's podcast saying they used to love the podcast, but now it's just one long ad. And worst of all, that their products are a scam. I literally just went on their podcast, and this review is from 3 days before the date of this recording. I used to love this podcast. The early episodes are so good, but it's been so scripted for a long time now, and courses/products are very scammy. Just go to Reddit and do a quick Google search. The solo episodes feel like is reading an actual script word for word versus authentically like many other podcasters do. I don't think that she writes her own podcast outlines or scripts, or if she does, she's not getting familiar enough with the script before reading it to not sound like a robot. It is hard to listen to. Yikes, big yikes. Remember that thing I said earlier about flying too close to the sun? That was my favorite podcaster. And now I don't even follow her podcast or any of her social medias. And when you aren't focused on your audience, someone else will be. And that's why I want to share this cautionary tale, because having a podcast is not easy. This is not a quick way to make money. Can you make a lot of money podcasting? Of course. You can make a lot of money podcasting, but you have to put your listeners first, or you won't have any listeners. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the bare minimum of what you will need and how you know it's time to monetize your podcast. Because that's what we're all here for, right? And the answer is when you have trust with your audience, that's when the when you can part of that two-step equation will really come into play. Some podcasters already have an audience before they even start their podcast. and they've already built up the trust and relationship with their audience, so they can really easily monetize their podcast on day one. They already have followers who trust them. But where the real problem starts to creep in, like the podcaster we were talking about just a few minutes ago, where you have a disproportionate amount of selling to value or selling to trust. That podcaster might have assumed that she had a relationship where she could just sell blindly to her listeners and that they wanted to buy. But unfortunately, she was incorrect. There's a customer journey model in marketing that's centered around your listener or customer having to go through 3 different phases with you. And the first one is that they know about you. So finding you, finding out who you are, actually discovering your podcast. So that's phase 1. Phase 2 is liking you, liking to listen to your podcast, getting to know your personality and your story, liking you enough to actually come back to your podcast every week and continue to get to know you. And the last phase is trusting you, seeing you as an expert that they trust and someone that they want to invest their time, energy, and money into. We need our listeners to know, like, and trust us before we can ever make a sale. And that goes for any kind of business ever. So I want you to think about that when you're thinking about when you can monetize this podcast. How many people who are listening to your podcast every week are in the like or trust phase of getting to know you? That is going to be a huge question for you moving forward. A quick exercise that I think is going to be very useful for you is to take a minute and think about the podcast that you have been, quote unquote, influenced by. So, like my story earlier, have you ever bought a digital course or attended a workshop or used someone's coupon code or in any way spent money because a podcast host inspired you to do so? Think about that. Think about what journey you went on with that podcast host before you trusted them enough to buy from them. And this can be anything, whether it's a product that they themselves are selling or that they have, again, influenced you to buy. What did the journey of know, like, trust look like for you as a podcast listener? And what did it take to convert you from listener to buyer? Just speaking for myself here, but most of the time, the easiest way for me to judge other people's buying habits and consider how they buy on a more practical level is to think about myself as a buyer. I think if you take a minute to write down, again, any podcast you've ever bought anything from, think about how long it took you to build the trust with that podcast and host and what they've done to earn your trust through the value that they are providing through their podcast. It's going to give you a lot of clarity on what this journey of monetization will look like for you. But that being said, what does podcast monetization really look like? I mean, we throw that around all the time, especially the different phases of the podcasting journey. So let's go ahead and break it down to beginner, intermediate, and experienced podcasters to talk about what the 3 levels of podcast monetization is going to look like for most of us. Starting with the beginning stages of monetization, again, this is going to depend so much on what your level of industry awareness is. So your audience and the trust that you've already built with your brand or personal brandings on other social medias or through events or whatever it might be. Basically, how many people know you? How many people are going to be listening to this podcast day one just because they already know, like, and trust you? I've worked with podcasters that have literally had no following at all. Nobody knew who they were. And podcasts who are leaders in their industry with hundreds of thousands of followers. So the crazy thing is, technically, when they both launched their first episode, they are both beginner podcasters. But they're starting at drastically different places in their listener journey, in their listener know, like, and trust phases. Because for the person who has no credibility anywhere else, this is totally starting from zero, whereas the person who has a huge following, that is just a continuation of everything else that they've built. But for this example, let's say you have no following at all, or a very modest following of peers. You're starting your podcast and you're building it from the ground up, because that's where most of us are going to be starting our podcast journey. And I think that that's a great place to start. until you have at least 100 dedicated downloads to each new episode. So you're getting 100 downloads from 100 different people on a new episode in the span of a week. I would not worry about monetizing this podcast. For most of us, getting our first dedicated 100 listeners will be the hardest bridge to cross in this listenership. So pour into your podcast. Look at what's working. Try to improve your reach and writing and recording. Try to make sure that every episode is better than the one that you published last week. That should be your number one priority. Focus on promoting your podcast and starting with the question of, do people know your podcast? Do they know who you are? Because you might feel like you are screaming from the rooftops, but getting your first 100 podcast listeners is going to take quite a bit of dedication and effort if you're starting from nothing, and also if you don't have money to invest in paid advertising. So focus on that first. Because again, if you don't have anybody to advertise to, it really does not matter what your monetization journey is. You have to have that first. So let's fast forward. Let's say that you have 250 dedicated listeners on every episode. It's been a few months or a year, and you're starting to gain some traction with downloads. This is a great time to start selling your own products. So start talking about what you do, how people can work with you, and start giving away those freebies or downloads so that people can get on your newsletter, and just generally promoting yourself. Also, start reaching out for affiliate programs and seeing what you can work out with smaller partnerships. Maybe someone will send you a product in exchange for an ad. My best advice is just to start where you are, but get started. I always encourage my podcasters at the beginning of their monetization journey to try out affiliate ads, because, that will signal to the other businesses that might be listening or interested in advertising with you that you do have ads, that you want to have sponsorships, but it won't require that you hit the threshold of the thousands of weekly downloads that it might take to get your first paid ad. All right, so next let's talk about our intermediate podcaster. Maybe somebody getting between 500 and 10,000 downloads on a new episode. So again, this is the first week the episode is launched, and in those 7 days, you're getting that number of downloads. I'd continue with the self-promotion, but I'd change a few things. Make ads for yourself. So make an ad like you would be making it for a company. Have very clear calls to action, whether that's to book a service or buy a product. You better be telling people exactly what it is and where they can buy it. Make it as easy as possible and make it very clear that this is how you advertise a product. Because again, so much of this is about showing other people what they can expect out of you if they were to hire you to do an ad. I'd be searching out industry-specific partnerships. So again, this will be personalized to every podcast, but I'd think about what industry I'm in and pursue those more niche businesses that could benefit from my exact audience. So maybe if I have a podcast about traveling to Disney World, I would be contacting a few different agents that typically work with Disney travel. I would be talking to specifically Disney hotels. Like I'm saying, go very niche and explain why your audience is the perfect audience to hear about their product or service. If you're interested in hearing more about how to land these partnerships, I would listen to episode 14, How to Get Your First Podcast Sponsor, or episode 16, How to Price Podcast Ads. I'll put the link for both of those in the episode description. All right, so what about for my experienced podcasters and for my established podcasters that are getting anywhere from 10 to 15,000 downloads on new episodes and above? All of the previous ideas that I've given you, I think are great for this level of podcaster. But then also on top of that, this is where the doors totally fly off. And you have a lot more options on working with brands that are not necessarily in a very, very small niche, but that want to work with podcasts to get exposure. Monetizing at this level can really be done in a variety of different ways. I would be happy to make a podcast about the agencies and platforms and outreach methods that I use when I'm securing ads for podcasts with that amount of downloads and following. But the biggest thing is to have your pricing on hand. Know what you want and what you are expecting. So that way, when an opportunity comes around, you can make sure that you're the one that's getting it. If you need a rate card to send out to businesses or you just want one on hand when you are pitched with an ad idea, I have an absolutely incredible template that I've spent the past 5 years perfecting. I'll attach the link in the episode description. But I just want to remind you that the most important thing when you're thinking about when you want to monetize your podcast is that, yes, it is about numbers, but also more importantly, it is about the mission. It is about finding the balance between when you want to monetize and when you are able to, and understanding that if it's done the wrong way, it could cost you the most valuable resource of all, your listeners. So pay attention to your listeners. Pay attention to the value that you are creating. And as always, I can't wait to listen to your podcast. Hey, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. If you enjoyed the podcast and you'd like to hear more episodes like this one, go ahead and subscribe to the show. New episodes air every Monday morning. And if you found this episode valuable and you want to help other business owners and podcasters, will you leave me a 5-star review? It helps the show rank higher in the charts and brings more entrepreneurs the information they need to start making money on their podcasts.